What if everything you believe about the afterlife is wrong? Arthur Schopenhauer believed that death is not a gateway, but a return. Not to heaven, not to hell, but to the same state you were in before you were born. In this video, we explore one of the most haunting questions in philosophy. What happens after death, according to Schopenhauer and beyond? What truly happens when we die? This question has haunted every civilization, every philosophy, and every conscious mind for thousands of years. From the earliest myths to modern neuroscience, we've searched for clues, tried to pierce the veil that separates existence from non-existence. But few answers are as provocative or as chilling as the one offered by Arthur Schopenhauer. You will be what you were before you were born. In this single sentence, Schopenhauer collapses every comforting idea about immortality. No heaven, no reincarnation, no soul drifting into a higher plane. Just a quiet return to the same nothingness from which we came. This isn't nihilism for the sake of shock. It's a confrontation with reality, unfiltered and unflinching. For Schopenhauer, death is not a tragedy. It is the cessation of striving. And what comes after death? The same thing that came before life. Nothing. Not a darkness, not an awareness of silence, but pure non-being. In a world where every culture tries to soothe our death anxiety through religion, ritual, or reincarnation, Schopenhauer cuts through it all like a cold blade through fog. He offers no afterlife, no hope, but also no fear. Why fear death, he suggests, if we did not suffer before we were born? This is not an answer many want, but it might be the answer that philosophy demands. Schopenhauer's chilling clarity about death didn't emerge in isolation. His voice echoes across the centuries, resonating with thinkers who also gazed into the abyss and chose to describe what they saw. Epicurus, writing 2,000 years earlier, offered a strikingly similar view. Death is nothing to us, he said, for when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist. This elegant reasoning removes fear by dissolving the self at the moment of death. Like Schopenhauer, Epicurus viewed death not as a transformation, but as non-experience, the absence of sensation, thought, and pain. It's not that we enter a dark room, it's that the room itself disappears. And yet, this idea doesn't calm everyone. Enter Martin Heidegger, who challenged us to live with the awareness that we are beings toward death. According to Heidegger, the anxiety of death isn't about its pain, but about its impossibility to experience. It's the one event in life that we never truly go through. We disappear before we can say, I am dying. This dread, the impossibility of witnessing your own end, is where Emil Cioran builds his bleak cathedral. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late, he wrote. Cioran saw consciousness as a kind of punishment. For him, the real tragedy was not dying, but having ever been born. Eastern philosophy, too, whispers similar themes, but in softer tones. In Buddhism, the idea of anatta, no permanent self, mirrors Schopenhauer's belief in the illusion of individuality. Death, in this view, is not a personal ending, because there was never a personal beginning, just a temporary formation dissolving back into the stream. These overlapping voices, from east to west, ancient to modern, form a chorus around a single truth. Death is not something that happens to you, because the you is the very thing death takes away. At the heart of Schopenhauer's idea of death lies something even more radical: the denial of a fixed self. For him, what we call I is nothing more than a fleeting appearance, a byproduct of the will, that blind, insatiable force driving all life. If the self is just a ripple in the surface of a deeper, unconscious ocean, then death is simply the moment when the ripple vanishes, not a tragedy, but a return. This unsettling thought draws us straight into conversation with Carl Jung. Jung believed that the self can be made whole, but only by integrating its unconscious layers. The ego, the persona, the shadow, all must be confronted, embraced, and balanced to approach what he called the self with a capital S. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung wrote, It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Jung's model offers a more active role for the human being, whereas Schopenhauer sees the self as a passive illusion governed by the will. Jung believes in a psychological path toward individuation, a slow sculpting of the soul, before it dissolves. But what both agree on is this: the self is not what it seems. Whether it's a torment to be quieted, as Schopenhauer thought, or a mystery to be understood, as Jung believed, both views challenge the notion that death is an event that happens to us because in the deepest sense, there is no stable us to receive it. In Jungian terms, we're a shifting constellation of roles, instincts, memories, fears. In Schopenhauer's vision, we're simply the dream of the will, destined to fade. And yet, it is in this fading that we may find peace, because if the self is not eternal, then neither is its suffering. To fully understand Schopenhauer's radical stance on death, we must look at the man who lit his philosophical fire, Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that we can never access the thing in itself, reality as it truly is. What we experience is merely phenomenal reality, filtered through space, time, and causality, lenses built into our minds. Schopenhauer took this and went a step further. He claimed that while everything we perceive is filtered and constructed, behind it all lies a blind force, the will, that drives existence, indifferent to our hopes, our meanings, even our deaths. So if death is the end of the phenomenal self, what happens to the will? Schopenhauer says, it continues, not as you, but as existence itself. This perspective echoes Buddhist and Hindu thought, systems that long ago denied the permanence of the self. In Buddhism, the idea of anatta, non-self, tells us that what we call I is merely a bundle of perceptions. And when those perceptions end, in death, there is nothing to grieve, because there was no unchanging entity to begin with. In Hinduism, too, Atman is not your personality, your ego, or your biography. It's the universal consciousness, and death is not a loss, but a reintegration. Now shift the lens to quantum physics, where things get stranger still. Particles exist in multiple states until observed. Information isn't destroyed, it's transformed. The boundary between observer and observed begins to blur, and in this realm, the idea of a fixed identity collapses. It's not that quantum mechanics confirms any philosophical theory, but it does show us this: the universe may be far less solid and far less personal than we imagine. And if the self is not a fixed point in space and time, then perhaps death is not a clean break. Perhaps it's a return, not to heaven or hell, but to the formless field from which consciousness briefly emerged. As Schopenhauer might say, life and death are two sides of the same illusion. The only truth is the will. If Schopenhauer claimed that death returns us to the nothingness before birth, Cioran took that void and made it into a kind of home. His world is stripped of redemption. No metaphysics, no afterlife, not even the cold comfort of a cosmic will. What remains? A consciousness that knows too much. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late, Cioran writes with the kind of detachment only a man allergic to hope could muster. Where Schopenhauer believed suffering stemmed from desire, Cioran thought awareness itself was the curse. To be born was to be sentenced, not because we fear death, but because we are burdened with the knowledge of it. Yet, paradoxically, this darkness produces a strange kind of lucidity. Cioran, like Schopenhauer, knew that clinging to life is absurd. But unlike Schopenhauer, who found in art and philosophy a way to transcend suffering, Cioran found only style, irony, and silence. He walked among cemeteries not as a mourner, but as a poet of the end. He once wrote, "We die in proportion to the words we fling around us," as if language itself were a slow suicide. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps all this talk of meaning, of afterlife, of purpose, is just our last defense against a deeper, silent truth, that death is not a doorway. It's the collapse of the architecture altogether. Still, even in this bleakness, there's an aesthetic, an elegance. Cioran's despair, much like Schopenhauer's pessimism, isn't a scream. It's a whisper that reverberates. And in that whisper, we may find the courage to look death in the eye and say, "You have already taken everything that I never truly owned." Arthur Schopenhauer once asked us to consider a haunting symmetry. After your death, you will be what you were before your birth. No heaven, no hell, no divine court. Just the silent, eternal neutrality that preceded your first cry. And yet, perhaps that silence is not a punishment, but a release. In this video, we've walked through the minds of those who dared to strip death of its costumes. Epicurus tried to calm us with logic. Jung searched the unconscious for something eternal. Heidegger urged us to live as beings toward death. Cioran gave us darkness laced with poetry. And Schopenhauer? He told us to let go of everything, even ourselves. These weren't cold theories. They were survival tools, lanterns held against the storm of mortality. And now perhaps you find yourself not with answers, but with better questions. What if you are not a thing, but a process? What if death is not a wall, but a veil? What if the terror of dying comes only from the illusion that you were ever truly alive in the way you imagined? Schopenhauer's vision is not easy to accept. It is not warm. It is not comforting. But in its austere honesty, there may be freedom. The freedom to live without illusions. The freedom to release your grip on what was never yours to hold. The freedom to say, as the Stoics might have, memento mori, and smile. And so we end, not with a promise of what comes next, but with a stillness that asks you to sit, breathe, and simply be. Whatever you were before you were born, you are on your way there again. And perhaps that's okay. So perhaps the question isn't, what happens after death? But rather, what were you before you were born? Arthur Schopenhauer didn't offer comfort. He offered clarity. He stripped away the illusions, the myths, the heavens, the promises, and left us with a raw silence. A silence not of fear, but of understanding. If death is the return to non-being, then life is the brief echo within it. And what a strange, beautiful echo it is, full of longing, of desire, of pain, of love. But temporary, always temporary. We fear death not because it is the end, but because it reminds us that we were never truly in control. And yet, in accepting this, we become free. Not in a superficial sense, but in the most profound way possible. Free to live authentically. Free to release our grasp on permanence. Free to simply be, for however long the moment lasts. So now, I leave you with the stillness, with the silence that came before you, and the silence that will come again. Between those silences, you were here. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. If this thought moved you, share your silence with us in the comments. What were you before you were born? And if you found meaning in these words, please consider subscribing. Not just to a channel, but to a deeper journey into thought, being, and everything in between. Share this video with someone who's been asking the same questions. You never know whose inner silence it might reach.